Professor Zixathara sat in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Archives Council and waited for the announcement that would change everything. The professor was a Velcaran, a species known across the galaxy for their skill in recording and studying history. Zixathara had spent 200 cycles documenting the rise and fall of civilizations, and had earned respect from every corner of known space. The Velcarans were peaceful by nature, having evolved on a garden world where predators never existed and food grew abundantly. Conflict was something they studied in other species but never truly understood in their hearts. The council chamber was massive, with representatives from 40 different species present. The air hummed with translation devices converting thousands of languages into understandable patterns. Zixathara's skin flickered with patterns of anticipation, the Velcaran way of showing emotion. Today the council would assign the newest project, and Zixathara hoped it would be something interesting. The head counselor, a floating gas being from the Andromeda sector, began speaking. The humans, a newly contacted species who had joined the galactic community only 3 cycles ago, had finally agreed to open their historical databases for academic review. The room buzzed with interest. Humans were fascinating to everyone. They had achieved space travel relatively quickly and their technology was impressive. Most interesting was how eager they seemed to join the galactic community. Unlike some species who remained isolated for generations after first contact, the counselor explained that this would be a significant project. Human history spanned thousands of years and their records were incredibly detailed. They documented everything, even the mundane aspects of daily life. The species who studied them would gain valuable insight into how humans thought and developed. Several historians expressed interest immediately. Zixathara raised 3 of their 6 limbs in the traditional gesture of acceptance. The professor had studied the peaceful transitions of the Anthari, documented the philosophical golden age of the Morvans, and written extensively about the harmonious expansion of the Keltarians. Human history would be another fascinating tale of gradual evolution and cooperative growth. Perhaps humans had some unique cultural developments or interesting artistic movements. Zixathara felt excited about discovering what made this new species special. The council assigned the project to Zixathara within moments. The professor's credentials were impeccable, and their previous work had set the standard for historical documentation. Zixathara's skin flashed bright colors of joy and professional pride. This would be the crowning achievement of an already distinguished career. The first data packet arrived at Zixathara's research station 3 days later. The professor settled into the translation chamber, a comfortable space designed for long hours of study. The walls displayed information in patterns of light that Velcorans could absorb directly through their skin. It was far more efficient than reading text or watching videos. Zixathara activated the system and began the review. The early entries were exactly what the professor expected. Humans started as hunter-gatherers, small groups moving across their planet in search of food. They learned to control fire, developed tools, and eventually discovered agriculture. The agricultural revolution led to permanent settlements, then villages, then cities. It was a common pattern seen in dozens of species. Zixathara made notes about the relatively rapid pace of human development, but saw nothing unusual. The Bronze Age began, and humans developed more sophisticated tools and social structures. They built temples and palaces, created art and music, invented writing systems to record their knowledge. Zixathara felt pleased with the progress. Then a word appeared in the records that made the professor pause. Zixathara checked the translation matrix, certain there must be an error. The word seemed to describe organized violence between groups of the same species on a massive scale. That couldn't be correct. Species had disagreements, certainly. Resources were sometimes scarce and groups might have brief conflicts over territory or food. But organized, planned violence involving thousands of individuals? That was abnormal. The professor continued reading and the word appeared again. And again. The Trojan War, where humans fought for 10 years over a stolen woman. The records described armies of thousands clashing with swords and spears. Zixathara's 3 hearts began beating irregularly, a sign of distress in Velcarans. This had to be exaggeration, perhaps mythological stories that humans told rather than actual history. But the records continued with more detail. The Peloponnesian War, where 2 human city-states fought for nearly 30 years. The Punic War is a series of conflicts spanning over a century. Each entry included casualty numbers that seemed impossible. Tens of thousands dead in single battles. Entire cities destroyed, populations enslaved or killed. Zixathara discovered something even more disturbing. Humans didn't just fight these wars. They studied warfare. They developed strategies and tactics. They wrote instruction manuals on how to kill each other more efficiently. A human named Sun Tzu had written an entire book called The Art of War, and other humans still studied it thousands of years later. It was treated as a philosophical masterpiece. The professor had to stop reading and sit in silence. In all of Velkaran history, spanning over 2 million years, there had been exactly 17 deaths from internal conflict. 17. Most of those were accidents during heated disagreements. The idea of deliberately planning how to kill members of your own species, writing books about it, teaching it to others, was beyond comprehension. Zixthara forced themselves to continue. Perhaps this was just an early phase. Young species sometimes struggled with resource allocation. Surely as humans became more advanced, they would abandon such practices. The professor moved forward in the timeline through the Roman Empire, through the medieval period, looking for the turning point where humanity embraced peace. Instead, the violence escalated. The Mongol conquest appeared in the records, and Zixthara felt physical illness for the first time in their adult life. Genghis Khan, a single human, had created an empire through conquest that killed approximately 40 million people. 40 million. That number was larger than the entire current population of 3 Velkoran colony worlds combined. The professor's skin flickered through colors of horror and disbelief. 40 million deaths, and the humans treated Genghis Khan as a historical figure worthy of study, and in some cases admiration. They were humans who considered him a great leader and a military genius. The concept of admiring someone who caused such massive death was incomprehensible. Zixthara checked the chronological markers. The Mongol conquests occurred around Earth year 1200, and the records continued for another 800 years beyond that point. The professor had barely begun the review, and already felt overwhelmed by what they had discovered. How much worse could it get? How many more wars would there be? How did humans survive as a species if they spent so much effort trying to destroy each other? The questions swirled in Zixthara's mind as they sat in the quiet research station. Outside, the stars shone peacefully through the observation window. Somewhere out there, humans lived and worked alongside other galactic species. They seemed normal, friendly even. How could the species described in these historical records be the same species that had joined the galactic community with such enthusiasm and cooperation? The professor saved the progress report and left the translation chamber. Sleep would be necessary before continuing. Velkorans needed rest cycles to process information and maintain health. Zixthara moved to the rest chamber and lay down, expecting the usual quick transition to sleep that came after a productive work session. But sleep did not come. Every time Zixthara closed their optical sensors, images from the historical records appeared in their mind. Armies clashing on fields, cities burning, the number 40 million repeating endlessly. The professor's skin flickered with colors of distress throughout the night. This had never happened before. Zixthara had studied the collapse of civilizations, the extinction of species, the heat death of stars. None of it had affected sleep, but this was different. This wasn't disaster or natural tragedy. This was deliberate, planned, organized, species-wide systematic violence. And Zixthara had only reviewed a small portion of human history. There were centuries more to study, and based on the pattern so far, the violence would only increase with human technological advancement. As the station's artificial dawn began lighting the rest chamber, Zixthara lay awake and stared at the ceiling. The professor had agreed to document human history, to help the galactic community understand this new species. But now a terrible question formed in Zixthara's mind. What if understanding humans meant discovering that the galaxy had welcomed something dangerous into their peaceful civilization? What if the humans' friendly behavior was just a temporary state, and their true nature was violence? The professor's 3 hearts beat in discord, unable to find their usual rhythm. Tomorrow would bring more research, more discoveries, more horrors from human history. Zixthara would continue the work because that was what historians did. They documented truth regardless of how uncomfortable it made them. Zixthara returned to the translation chamber the next morning with determination mixed with dread. The professor's rest cycle had been terrible, filled with fragmented images and disturbing thoughts. But the work had to continue. Perhaps the medieval period was just a dark phase in human development. Surely once humans developed more advanced technology and better education systems, they would have abandoned their violent tendencies. Civilization was supposed to make species more peaceful, not less. The Renaissance period began promisingly. Humans were creating magnificent art and making scientific discoveries. Leonardo da Vinci was painting masterpieces and designing flying machines. Michelangelo was sculpting wonders from marble. Human literature was flourishing with writers like William Shakespeare, crafting stories that explored the depths of human emotion and thought. Zixthera felt a wave of relief. Here was the turning point, the moment when humanity chose knowledge and beauty over violence. But then the colonial period began and Zixthera's hope vanished. European humans built ships and sailed across their oceans to find new lands. What they did when they arrived made the Mongol conquests look almost restrained by comparison. The Spanish conquistadors encountered the Aztec and Inca civilizations, advanced cultures with their own art, science, and social structures. Within decades, these civilizations were essentially destroyed. Millions died from warfare, enslavement, and diseases the Europeans brought with them. The professor read accounts from both sides when such accounts existed. The Aztecs had their own violent practices, including ritual sacrifice, but the scale of destruction the Europeans brought was something entirely different. Entire ways of life were erased. Languages died out. Knowledge was lost forever, and the Europeans justified it with religious and cultural superiority, believing they were bringing civilization to savages. Zixthera's skin patterns became darker, a Velcarin sign of deep emotional disturbance. The concept of believing your own culture superior enough to destroy others was alien to galactic thinking. The Galactic Council operated on principles of cultural relativism and mutual respect. Every species had value and deserved preservation. But humans in this period seemed to believe the opposite. The 30 Years' War appeared in the records next. This conflict devastated Central Europe and killed approximately 8 million people. The war was partly about religion, different groups of humans fighting over interpretations of their spiritual beliefs. Zixthera had studied hundreds of species and their belief systems. Never had the professor encountered a species that killed each other in such massive numbers over theological disagreements. The Napoleonic era followed, and Zixthera learned about a single human who plunged an entire continent into war for over a decade. Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to expand French territory and influence. Millions died in the process. The Battle of Waterloo alone involved over 200,000 soldiers. Humans were organizing violence on a scale that required massive logistical planning, supply chains, and coordination. They were getting better at war, more efficient at killing. The professor paused the review and checked the timeline. There were still 2 more centuries to cover, and human technology would advance dramatically during this period. If humans fought wars with swords and cannons that killed millions, what would they do with more advanced weapons? Zixthera's 3 hearts raced with anxiety. The professor almost stopped the project entirely, but professional duty demanded continuation. The 20th century data loaded into the translation chamber. World War I began in Earth year 1914. Zixthera read the opening entries with growing horror. This war was called the Great War by humans at the time. They believed it would be so terrible that humanity would never fight another major war again. The optimism seemed naive given everything the professor had already learned, but perhaps humans finally understood the cost of their violence. The Battle of the Somme appeared in the records. On the first day of this battle, nearly 20,000 British soldiers died. In one day. The professor had to verify the translation multiple times because the number seemed impossible. The battle continued for months, and by its end, over 1 million soldiers were casualties. Zixthera learned about trench warfare, where soldiers lived in muddy ditches for months and occasionally climbed out to charge across open ground toward enemy positions. Machine guns mowed them down by the hundreds. The life expectancy of a soldier ordered to go over the top was sometimes measured in minutes. Officers kept ordering these charges despite knowing most of the men would die. The soldiers kept obeying despite knowing they would probably die. Chemical weapons entered the historical record. Humans developed poison gas and used it against each other. Chlorine gas, mustard gas, phosgene. These weapons caused horrific deaths, dissolving lungs and burning skin. The professor read descriptions from soldiers who survived gas attacks and felt physically ill. What kind of species developed weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering? World War I ended in 1918 with approximately 17 million dead. The number was so large Zixthera had difficulty processing it emotionally. 17 million individuals, each with their own thoughts, dreams, families, and potential futures. Gone. The professor saved the progress and had to leave the translation chamber. Walking through the research station, Zixthara passed other historians working on different projects. They all seemed calm and content. None of them were studying anything like this. The professor returned after a break and continued the review. World War II began just 21 years after World War I ended. Humans had not learned. They had not changed. They had simply rebuilt and prepared to fight again, this time with even better weapons and on a truly global scale. The death toll from World War II was over 70 million. 70 million. Zixthara's mind could barely comprehend the number. It was more than the total population of most galactic species. The professor read through the major events and battles, each one adding layers of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. The Holocaust appeared in the records. Nazi Germany, led by a human named Adolf Hitler, systematically murdered 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, including disabled individuals, political prisoners, and ethnic minorities. This wasn't even warfare in the traditional sense. It was industrialized genocide. Humans built camps specifically designed to kill other humans as efficiently as possible. They used poison gas in chambers disguised as showers. They kept meticulous records of who they killed and how. Zixthara had to stop reading multiple times. The professor's skin had turned almost black, a color Velkarans only displayed during the most extreme trauma. At one point, Zixthara experienced physical purging, vomiting on the floor of the translation chamber. The automatic cleaning systems removed the mess, but nothing could clean the images from the professor's mind. The Eastern Front of World War II showed sustained brutality across years. The siege of Leningrad lasted over 2 years and killed more than 1 million people, many from starvation. The Battle of Stalingrad killed nearly 2 million soldiers and civilians. Humans fought house to house, room to room, sometimes engaging in hand-to-hand combat with knives and sharpened tools when ammunition ran out. Then Zixthara reached the atomic bombs. The professor read the technical specifications first, without understanding the implications. Humans had learned to split atoms and harness the energy released. That was impressive science, the kind of breakthrough that usually led species toward post-scarcity civilizations and peaceful exploration of the cosmos. But humans weaponized it first. They built bombs that could destroy entire cities in seconds. The first bomb was dropped on a city called Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The weapon killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the following weeks from radiation poisoning and injuries. 3 days later, humans dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people immediately. Zixthara read the accounts from survivors. People described humans walking with their skin hanging off their bodies, children looking for parents who had been vaporized, shadows burned into walls where people had been standing when the blast hit. The radiation caused cancers and birth defects for generations afterward. The professor found records from the pilot who dropped the first bomb. His name was Paul Tibbets, and he flew the aircraft Enola Gay, named after his mother. This detail struck Zixthara as particularly disturbing. A human who loved his mother enough to name his aircraft after her had also killed 80,000 people, and reportedly never expressed regret about the action. When interviewed years later, Tibbets said he was following orders and believed it helped end the war sooner, potentially saving more lives than it took. The logic made sense from a certain perspective but felt monstrous from another. Zixthara tried to imagine making such a choice and couldn't. The professor's entire species couldn't imagine it. If Velkarans faced a threat requiring such action, they would likely choose extinction over killing so many innocents. But humans had made the calculation and decided mass death was acceptable if it served their strategic goals. The translation chamber's lights seemed too bright. Zixthara sat in darkness and tried to process everything. World War II ended in 1945. Zixthara forced themselves back to the translation chamber, despite every instinct screaming to stop the research. The professor's physical health was deteriorating. Velkaran medical staff had visited twice to check on the cardiac discord that wouldn't resolve. The 3 hearts continued beating in separate rhythms, a condition that should have been temporary but had persisted for days. The medical staff recommended halting the project, but Zixthara refused. Something compelled the professor forward, a need to see the complete picture regardless of personal cost. The Cold War period loaded into the translation system. Zixthara hoped desperately that humans had learned from World War II. Surely after developing atomic weapons and using them, humanity would have stepped back from the brink and chosen peace. The professor's hopes died within minutes of beginning the review. Not only had humans not stopped building atomic weapons, they built more. Many more. Then they developed hydrogen bombs, weapons thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the peak of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy Earth's surface hundreds of times over. The concept was called overkill, having more destructive capacity than necessary to achieve your objective. Zixthera read this fact multiple times, certain the translation was wrong. Why would any species build enough weapons to destroy their own world hundreds of times? Once seemed more than sufficient if destruction was the goal. But humans had built arsenals capable of killing every human who had ever existed, if they could somehow all be alive simultaneously. The reasoning made no sense to the Velcoran mind. The strategy behind this massive buildup was called mutually assured destruction. Both sides maintained peace by promising that if either attacked, both would be completely destroyed. The humans even abbreviated it as MAD, and Zixthera found the acronym grimly appropriate. What kind of species maintains peace through the threat of mutual extinction? How did humans live normal lives knowing their civilization could end in nuclear fire at any moment, based on the decisions of a handful of leaders? The professor discovered that humans had come close to nuclear war several times during this period. In 1962, a confrontation called the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the edge of destruction. For 13 days, human leaders debated whether to start a war that would likely kill hundreds of millions. They chose peace, but barely. Later information revealed how close they came to catastrophic mistakes, based on miscommunication and technical errors. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov received warnings that American missiles were incoming. His orders were to report the attack, which would trigger Soviet retaliation and start nuclear war. But Petrov decided the warnings were probably a computer error and didn't report them. He was correct. A single human's judgment call prevented the potential death of millions. Zixthera found this terrifying. Human extinction was avoided not through careful planning or robust systems, but through one individual's gut feeling. The Cold War era also brought numerous smaller conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of others. Zixthera learned these were called proxy wars, where the major powers avoided fighting each other directly, but supported opposite sides in regional conflicts. The Vietnam War lasted nearly 20 years and killed over 3 million people. The professor read about guerrilla warfare, napalm bombing, and villages destroyed because they might contain enemy soldiers. One incident particularly disturbed Zixthera. At a place called My Lai, American soldiers massacred hundreds of unarmed civilians, including children and elderly people. But then a helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson discovered what was happening. Thompson landed his helicopter between the soldiers and fleeing villagers. He ordered his door gunner to fire on his fellow Americans if they continued killing civilians. Thompson saved dozens of lives that day. This contradiction confused Zixthera more than almost anything else in the research. The same military, the same war, sometimes the same unit could produce both massacres and heroes. Humans capable of murdering children and humans willing to risk their lives to save strangers. How could one species contain such extremes? The professor's understanding of morality and nature was fundamentally challenged by this duality. The research revealed something else disturbing about humans. They created entertainment based on violence. Zixthera discovered action movies where heroes killed dozens of villains, video games where players simulated combat and warfare. Children, young humans whose minds were still developing, played games that recreated war scenarios. The professor watched footage from several first-person shooter games and felt sick. Humans were training their youth to think about violence, to become comfortable with simulated killing. Yet simultaneously, humans had peace movements, massive protests against wars, activists who dedicated their lives to nonviolence. The professor read about people like Martin Luther King Jr., who led a civil rights movement using peaceful resistance and was assassinated for his efforts. Nelson Mandela spent decades in prison for opposing apartheid, and emerged to preach reconciliation rather than revenge. Mahatma Gandhi helped free an entire nation from colonial rule without raising an army. The contradictions were overwhelming. Violent entertainment next to peace activists, nuclear weapons next to disarmament treaties, massacres next to heroic rescues. Zixthera couldn't reconcile these opposites into a coherent understanding of what humans actually were at their core. A human song appeared in the cultural database. It was called Where Have All the Flowers Gone, written by someone named Pete Seeger. Zixthera listened to the simple melody and felt something break inside. The song described a cycle. Flowers picked by young girls who grow up and marry young men who become soldiers who go to war and die, and return to graveyards where flowers grow. The cycle continues endlessly, generation after generation. The humans knew. They understood the horror and futility of war. They wrote songs about it, made art depicting its tragedy, taught their children about its costs. Yet they kept doing it anyway. This realization was somehow worse than the violence itself. Ignorance or instinct could be understood. But humans possessed full awareness of what they were doing and chose to continue. That implied something darker about human nature than Zixithera wanted to acknowledge. The professor compiled the data and requested an emergency meeting with the Archives Council. This was highly unusual. Researchers typically presented findings only upon project completion, but Zixithera felt compelled to share concerns immediately. If humans posed a danger to the galactic community, the council needed to know as soon as possible. The meeting took place in a smaller council chamber. Only 5 members attended on short notice. Zixithera's skin patterns were still dark and erratic, clearly indicating distress. The professor's 3 hearts continued their discordant rhythm. One council member commented that Zixithera looked unwell and should perhaps seek medical treatment before continuing. The professor ignored the suggestion and presented the findings. Human history contained more violence than all other known galactic species combined. Humans fought wars constantly throughout their development. They killed over 100 million of their own species in just the 20th century. They developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and came close to using them multiple times. The council members listened with expressions of shock and concern. A representative from the Anthari species asked if Zixithera was certain the translations were accurate. Perhaps human language used metaphorical expressions that seemed more violent than actual events. The professor provided raw data with verified translations from multiple independent sources. The violence was real, documented from countless perspectives and sources. A Keltirian counselor asked the crucial question: should the galactic community be concerned about human membership? Were humans a threat to other species? Had the council made a mistake welcoming them? Zixithera admitted not knowing the answer. The humans who joined the galactic community seemed peaceful and cooperative. They had shown no aggression toward any galactic species during 3 years of contact, but their history suggested a capacity for organized violence, far beyond anything the galaxy had encountered. That capacity didn't simply disappear because humans now had access to space travel and alien neighbors. The council debated for hours. Some members argued for increased monitoring of human activities. Others suggested limiting human access to certain technologies or information. A few wondered if humanity should be quietly isolated from the broader galactic community until they demonstrated longer-term peaceful behavior. But ultimately, the council decided that continuing normal relations was best. Humans had been peaceful since first contact. Punishing them for historical actions would be unfair and might actually provoke the hostility everyone feared. Instead, the council authorized increased funding for Zixithera's research and requested that the full historical report be completed as quickly as possible. Understanding humans completely was now a priority for galactic security. Zixithera returned to the research station feeling more burdened than before. The professor had hoped sharing the concerns would provide some relief. Instead, the responsibility felt heavier. The medical staff finally intervened after Zixithera collapsed in the translation chamber. The professor's 3 hearts had developed dangerous arrhythmias and vital signs indicated severe stress damage. Velcaran physicians insisted on mandatory rest for at least 3 cycles. Zixithera argued but lacked the strength to resist when orderlies gently removed the professor from the research station and transported them to medical facilities. During forced rest, Zixithera's mind wouldn't stop processing the information already absorbed. The images and numbers cycled endlessly through consciousness, but the medical intervention did provide time for reflection. The professor began thinking about specific details rather than just the overwhelming scale of violence. Small stories within the larger horror, individuals making choices in impossible situations. After 3 cycles of rest and treatment, Zixithera's heart stabilized enough for the physicians to allow limited return to work. But they also recommended something unusual. The professor should speak directly with a human. Reading historical documents provided facts but lacked context and perspective. Understanding how modern humans viewed their own violent history might offer insights the records couldn't. The Archives Council arranged a consultation. A human historian named Helen Martinez was currently stationed on Research Facility Epsilon 7 studying galactic cultural development. She specialized in military history and had written extensively about human warfare. The council believed she could provide the perspective Zixithara needed. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room, designed to accommodate multiple species' environmental needs. Zixithara arrived early and waited nervously. The professor had seen countless images of humans in the historical records, but this would be the first face-to-face meeting with an actual living human. Despite knowing rationally that humans were peaceful members of the galactic community, Zixithara felt apprehension. How do you sit across from someone whose species had killed hundreds of millions of their own kind? Helen Martinez entered the room, and Zixithara's first thought was how utterly normal she looked. A middle-aged female human wearing casual station clothing, she had graying hair and kind eyes and carried a data tablet. She smiled warmly and extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. Zixithara touched the hand briefly with one manipulator, completing the ritual. They sat down and Helen spoke first. Her voice was gentle, and her translator rendered the words in patterns Zixithara's skin could absorb. Helen said she had read the medical reports and understood that researching human history was causing the professor significant distress. She apologized for that and wanted Zixithara to know she was available to answer any questions that might help. Zixithara's skin flickered through several color patterns before settling on one, indicating serious inquiry. The professor asked the question directly without preamble. How are humans not extinct? How did a species survive when it spent thousands of years killing itself with increasing efficiency? Helen leaned back and considered her response carefully. She explained that humans asked themselves the same question regularly, especially during and after the World Wars. The answer was complicated, but essentially came down to humans being paradoxically both self-destructive and resilient. For every human who chose violence, there were many more who chose to build, create, heal, and nurture. Violence made dramatic history, but peace and cooperation were actually more common in daily human life. The professor asked about the nuclear weapons. Why did humans build enough to destroy their world hundreds of times? Helen's expression became more serious. She admitted that the Cold War nuclear buildup was madness, and most modern humans recognized it as such. Fear drove the arms race. Each side believed the other might attack, so they built more weapons to deter aggression. The strategy worked in preventing direct war between superpowers, but came terrifyingly close to causing the very destruction it was meant to prevent. Zixithara wanted to understand something more fundamental. Why did humans fight wars at all? What drove species members to organize systematic violence against each other? The Velkorans had evolved on a peaceful world and never developed such behaviors. What was different about humans? Helen explained that Earth was a harsh world compared to most in the galactic community. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a planet filled with megafauna predators. Survival required aggression, tactical thinking, and the ability to coordinate group violence against threats. Those traits were embedded deeply in human psychology. Early humans who weren't aggressive enough didn't survive to pass on their genetics, but humans were also intensely social creatures, Helen continued. They needed cooperation to survive. A lone human was vulnerable, but humans working together could overcome almost any challenge. That created an internal contradiction. Humans needed to be cooperative enough to build civilizations, but aggressive enough to defend themselves. The balance between those drives was difficult to maintain. Zixithara asked about the Holocaust and other genocides. Those weren't about survival or defense. Those were systematic elimination of groups that posed no real threat. How did Helen explain that level of cruelty? The professor's skin flickered with colors of genuine confusion and distress. Helen's expression showed pain. She said there was no good explanation or excuse for genocides. They represented humanity at its worst, driven by fear, prejudice, and the desire to create scapegoats for social problems. Humans had a terrible capacity for dehumanizing others, for categorizing groups as somehow less than human and therefore acceptable targets. The Holocaust happened because millions of ordinary people either participated or chose not to intervene. It was a collective moral failure that still haunted humanity. But Helen also pointed to the humans who resisted. People who hid Jewish families at great personal risk, soldiers who refused to participate in massacres, diplomats who saved thousands by issuing visas against orders. For every human who chose evil, there were humans who chose good even when it was dangerous or difficult. Zixithara brought up the entertainment issue. Why did humans make games and movies about violence? Why teach children to simulate warfare? Helen acknowledged this looked disturbing from an outside perspective, but she explained that humans explored darkness through fiction and play, as a way of processing it safely. Action movies let humans experience danger without real risk. War games let them explore tactical thinking without actual death. It was a form of psychological processing, not training for real violence. The professor remained skeptical. Simulation seemed like practice, but Helen pointed out that billions of humans played violent video games and watched action films. Yet only a tiny fraction ever committed actual violence. If entertainment caused real aggression, human society would be far more chaotic than it actually was. The vast majority of humans lived peaceful lives and never hurt anyone despite consuming violent media. Zixathara asked the question that had been haunting them since the council meeting. Should the galactic community be afraid of humans? Were they a threat to other species? Helen was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said honestly that she couldn't promise humans would never pose a threat. But she could share some important context. Human violence had been declining for centuries when measured per capita. Yes, World War II killed 70 million, but that was from a global population of 2.5 billion. Earlier wars, like the Mongol conquests or 30 Years' War, killed a higher percentage of affected populations. The trend was toward less violence, not more. Additionally, Helen explained that since achieving spaceflight, humans had developed a different perspective. Seeing Earth from space, understanding their place in the cosmos, meeting other intelligent species, all of this fundamentally changed human psychology. The old tribal instincts weakened when humans realized they were part of something much larger than their planet or species. Helen pulled up data on her tablet. She showed Zixathara statistics on human conflicts over the past century. Deaths from warfare had decreased dramatically. International institutions had been created to mediate disputes. Weapons that were once used freely, like chemical and biological agents, were now banned by treaty. Humans were actively working to be better than their history. The professor asked about human military forces. If humans were becoming peaceful, why did they still maintain armed services? Why not disarm completely? Helen smiled sadly at this question. She explained that humans had learned painful lessons about being unprepared. Peace was wonderful, but required the ability to defend it. Human military forces were smaller than at any point in the past century, and focused increasingly on humanitarian missions and disaster response rather than warfare. Zixathara wanted to know if Helen herself, as someone who studied military history, ever felt disturbed by what her species had done. The human woman's eyes became distant. She admitted that studying warfare, especially genocides and atrocities, took a psychological toll. She had colleagues who left the field because the emotional burden became too heavy. But Helen felt documenting and understanding violence was necessary to prevent it from recurring. She shared something personal. Her grandfather had fought in World War II and never spoke about his experiences. Years after he died, several weeks passed before Zixathara completed the full historical review. The remaining decades of human history contained more conflicts, but the pattern Helen Martinez described proved accurate. Human warfare was becoming less common and less deadly when measured as a percentage of population. Regional conflicts continued in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. Each was tragic and costly, but none approached the scale of the world wars. The trend was undeniably toward reduced violence. Zixathara also discovered something else in the recent records. Humans had created extensive international organizations dedicated to preventing war. The United Nations, imperfect as it was, provided a forum for diplomatic resolution of conflicts. The International Criminal Court prosecuted war crimes. Numerous treaties banned specific weapons and established rules for warfare. Humans were trying to constrain their own violent tendencies through law and cooperation. The professor prepared the final report for the Archives Council. The document was extensive, covering thousands of years of human history with particular focus on warfare and violence. But the conclusions were more nuanced than Zixathara had expected when beginning the project. Yes, humans were uniquely violent compared to other galactic species, but they were also uniquely self-aware and actively working to overcome that violence. The council meeting to present the final report drew a large audience. Word had spread through the galactic academic community about Zixathara's research and its disturbing findings. Representatives from dozens of species attended either in person or via holographic presence. The room buzzed with anticipation as the professor approached the presentation platform. Zixathara's skin still showed darker patterns than normal, evidence of the psychological toll the research had taken. The three hearts had synchronized somewhat, but still occasionally fell into discord during moments of stress. The medical staff wanted the professor to take extended leave after completing the project. Zixthera had agreed, knowing that recovery would require significant time away from academic work. The presentation began with basic statistics. Human recorded history spanned approximately 12,000 years. Documented wars numbered in the thousands. Total deaths from warfare exceeded several hundred million, with the majority occurring in the past 2 centuries. These numbers were orders of magnitude beyond any other known species. Several council members reacted with visible shock despite having read preliminary reports. Zixthera presented the data chronologically, showing how human warfare evolved from small tribal conflicts to global mechanized slaughter. The atomic bomb represented a turning point, the moment when humans gained the power to destroy themselves completely. The Cold War demonstrated how close humanity came to utilizing that power. Only luck and a few critical individual decisions prevented nuclear annihilation. But then the professor presented the other data: the declining per capita violence, the increasing length of peace between major conflicts, the development of international laws and institutions, the memorials and museums humans built to remember their wars and honor the dead, the peace movements and activists who opposed violence even during wartime. The trend lines all pointed toward a gradual but genuine reduction in human conflict. A Kelterian council member asked the question everyone was thinking. Given this history, should humans be trusted as members of the galactic community? Did their violent past make them a potential threat to other species? Zixthera took a long pause before responding, knowing the answer would carry significant weight. The professor explained that trust was perhaps the wrong framework for the question. Humans didn't ask to be violent. They evolved on a harsh world that required aggression for survival. Their violence wasn't a moral failing so much as an evolutionary adaptation that persisted beyond its usefulness. The relevant question wasn't whether to trust humans, but whether humans could continue choosing peace as they had been doing with increasing success. Zixthera shared insights from the conversation with Helen Martinez. Most galactic species were peaceful because they never evolved violent tendencies. They had no choice in the matter. But humans had to actively choose peace every day despite instincts pushing toward tribalism and conflict. That choice, made consciously and continuously, represented something potentially more stable than instinctive peace. Humans knew what violence cost because they had experienced it firsthand across generations. Another council member from the Anthari delegation asked about human military forces. If humans were becoming peaceful, why maintain armed services? Zixthera explained human philosophy around deterrence and defense. Humans had learned through painful history that being unprepared for violence made you vulnerable to those willing to use it. Their military forces were insurance, hopefully never needed but maintained just in case. The professor then shared something that had struck them during the research. In recent decades, human military forces increasingly focused on humanitarian missions, disaster relief, medical aid, rescue operations. When earthquakes struck or tsunamis devastated coastlines, human military assets were often first to respond with help. The same organizational capacity that made human armies effective in warfare also made them effective in saving lives during crises. This prompted discussion about the dual nature of human capabilities. Their aggression made them dangerous, but their cooperation and problem-solving made them incredible allies. The stubbornness that kept soldiers fighting in trenches for months also kept human scientists working for decades on seemingly impossible problems. The tactical thinking used in warfare also revolutionized fields like medicine, engineering, and space exploration. Zixthera presented data on human scientific contributions since joining the galactic community. In just 3 years, humans had made significant advances in material science, propulsion technology, and xenobiology. Their approach to problems was different from most species, more direct and aggressive in seeking solutions. This made some species uncomfortable, but it also produced results. The council debated for hours. Some members argued for restricting human access to certain technologies or information as a precautionary measure. Others felt such restrictions would be insulting and potentially counterproductive. A few suggested intensive monitoring of human activities. Most agreed that complete isolation was neither feasible nor desirable at this point. Finally, the council reached a decision. They would continue normal relations with humanity while maintaining standard observation protocols applied to all member species. Zixthera's complete historical report would be published and made available to any species wanting to understand human background. But humans would not be punished or restricted based on their history. Actions in the present mattered more than past behaviors. One council member, an elder Morvax with centuries of diplomatic experience, made an observation that resonated with many present. Every species had something in their past they weren't proud of. Most were fortunate enough that their mistakes were small-scale. Humans had the misfortune of being highly capable when they made mistakes, so their failures were proportionally larger. But judging them solely by their worst moments without acknowledging their capacity for good would be unfair. The meeting concluded, with the council formally accepting Zixthera's report and commending the professor for thorough and difficult work. Several council members privately expressed concern for Zixthera's health and urged the professor to take the recommended medical leave. The research had clearly taken a severe toll. Zixthera returned to personal quarters after the presentation and sat by the observation window looking out at stars. The project was complete. The burden of research could finally be set down. The professor felt exhausted in ways that went far beyond physical tiredness. Some fundamental part of Zixthera's worldview had been altered permanently by exposure to human history. Before the project, the professor had believed the universe was fundamentally peaceful with rare exceptions. Species might have disagreements, but generally resolved them through discussion and compromise. The discovery that an entire species had spent millennia killing each other in massive numbers shattered that comfortable worldview. The universe was more violent and dangerous than Zixthera had believed, but the project also revealed something unexpected. Humans were aware of their violence and actively fighting against it. They studied their wars obsessively, determined to understand what went wrong and how to prevent repetition. They memorialized victims and taught children about the costs of conflict. They had transformed what could have been a source of pride into a source of caution and grief. That evening, Zixthera began writing a personal addendum to the official report, something that wouldn't be published but would be archived for future historians who might study humanity. The professor wanted to record thoughts and feelings that raw data couldn't capture. The addendum discussed the psychological impact of researching human violence as a member of a peaceful species. How the images and numbers created persistent nightmares. How learning about genocide and atomic warfare made the universe feel darker and more threatening. But also how meeting Helen Martinez and understanding human context provided a more complete picture. Zixthera wrote about the engineer,